If this video showed up for you, it's because this story is gonna move you and give you chills. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of story, and comment which city you're watching from. The sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut echoes differently when you know it might be for the last time. For Daniel, the sound was a metronome counting down the final 72 hours of his life. The air in the cell block was stale, smelling of cold concrete, industrial cleaner, and the quiet despair of men who had run out of time. Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk, his rough palms pressed against his knees, staring at a beam of dust dancing in the sliver of light coming from the high window. He wasn't afraid of the needle. He wasn't afraid of the darkness that would follow. What kept him awake, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling until his eyes burned, was the thought of who he was leaving behind. Not a wife, not a child, but a soul that had loved him more unconditionally than any human ever could, Max. But Daniel had no idea that his final wish would trigger a chain of events that no one saw coming. Daniel was an inmate on death row, convicted of a crime he didn't commit, a robbery gone wrong, a life taken, and a man found in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence had been circumstantial, but damning. A net woven so tight he couldn't thrash his way out of it. He had spent the last 5 years in a 6x8 cage, maintaining his innocence until his voice grew hoarse and eventually fell silent. The world had moved on, labeling him a monster. But in the silence of his cell, Daniel clung to one memory. The night the police kicked down his door, Max, his German Shepherd mix, hadn't barked in aggression. He had whined. He had paced. It was as if the dog knew the tragedy that was unfolding before the handcuffs even clicked. Now, with the clock ticking down to 0, Daniel had stopped fighting for his life. He was fighting for a goodbye. He had filed a request that the warden called unprecedented and a security nightmare. He didn't want a last meal of steak or lobster. He didn't want a priest. He wanted 5 minutes in the prison yard with Max. The dog had been taken in by a shelter, miraculously saved from being put down, and was currently living with a foster family who knew the tragic history. The warden had stared at Daniel for a long time when the request hit his desk. He looked for the lie in Daniel's eyes, the manipulation typical of desperate men. But all he saw was a deep, aching sorrow. Against all protocol, and perhaps moved by a flicker of his own humanity, the warden signed the paper. The meeting was set. Daniel's hands shook as the guard approached his cell that morning. It wasn't the trembling of fear. It was the vibration of a heart breaking and healing at the same time. Officer Miller, a younger guard who had never treated Daniel with the disdain the others showed, unlocked the bars. "It's time, Daniel," he said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow corridor. They brought him in the back transport van. "He's in the secured yard." Daniel stood up, smoothing his orange jumpsuit. He felt lightheaded. The walk down the corridor felt endless, a journey through the belly of a concrete beast. Every step echoed like a drumbeat. Clack, clack, clack. He passed the other cells, ignoring the jeers and the whispers. His mind was focused on one image: golden fur, brown eyes, the tilt of a head that understood everything without a single word spoken. He wondered if Max would remember him. 5 years is a lifetime for a dog. Would he smell the prison on Daniel? Would he smell the death that was waiting for him? But there was something else he couldn't shake. A feeling that something was wrong. A prickle on the back of his neck that he couldn't explain. They reached the heavy steel door that led to the outdoor recreation yard. The sun was blinding as the door creaked open, a stark contrast to the internal twilight of the block. The air smelled of rain and wet asphalt. "Stay behind the yellow line until we secure the perimeter," a gruff voice commanded. It was Officer Jenkins, the senior guard on duty. Jenkins was a large man with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty that he barely bothered to hide. He stood by the fence, his hand resting casually on his baton, watching Daniel with a look of utter contempt. Daniel squinted against the glare. Across the yard, about 30 yards away, a handler stood holding a thick leash, and there, straining against the collar, was Max.
The dog looked older. His muzzle was dusted with gray, and he had lost some of the bulk of his youth. But as soon as Daniel stepped into the light, the dog froze. The ears pricked up. The tail gave a tentative thump against the handler's leg. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. The sound carried on the wind. Max let out a sharp bark, a sound of pure, unadulterated recognition. He pulled hard, his claws scrabbling against the concrete, desperate to bridge the gap between them. The handler struggled to hold him back. "Let him go," the warden ordered from the observation tower. The handler unclipped the leash. For a second, time seemed to suspend. Then, Max was a streak of gold and black tearing across the yard. Daniel dropped to his knees, disregarding the harsh gravel biting into his skin. He opened his arms, tears finally spilling over hot and fast. Max collided with him, nearly knocking him backward. Wet tongue, warm fur, the frantic whining of a creature reunited with his pack. Daniel buried his face in the dog's neck, breathing in the scent of rain and dog shampoo, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry," he murmured into the fur. It was a moment of pure love in a place built for punishment. Even the guards on the towers lowered their rifles slightly, watching the scene. But the peace was fragile, and it was about to shatter. As Daniel hugged Max, scratching behind the ears just the way he used to, he felt the dog's body suddenly go rigid. The frantic tail wagging stopped instantly. The soft whines of joy were cut off, replaced with a low, vibrating rumble deep in the dog's chest. Daniel pulled back, confused. "Max? What is it, boy?" Max wasn't looking at Daniel anymore. The dog had pulled away, placing himself between Daniel and the rest of the yard. His hackles, the fur along his spine, stood up in a jagged ridge. His lips curled back, revealing teeth that were no longer playing. He was staring directly at a specific point near the gate. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. Max wasn't looking at the handler. He wasn't looking at the open gate. He was staring dead at Officer Jenkins. Jenkins, who had been leaning against the fence looking bored, suddenly stiffened. The dog let out a snarl so vicious it echoed off the prison walls, a sound of primal aggression that Daniel had never heard from him before. Not once. Max was a lover, a protector, but never a killer. "Control your animal, inmate!" Jenkins shouted, his hand dropping to the taser on his belt. But there was something in Jenkins' voice that didn't match the command. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Daniel gripped Max's collar, trying to restrain him, but the dog was fixated. The growl grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't just a threat. It was an accusation. And that's when Daniel remembered something crucial about the night he was arrested. A detail he had buried under years of trauma. The realization hit him harder than the judge's gavel.
"Back off!" Jenkins screamed, his voice cracking. He ripped the baton from his belt, the black steel glinting in the sun. "I said control him or I will end him right here!" Max didn't flinch. He planted his feet, his chest heaving with a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Daniel wrapped both arms around the dog's thick neck, digging his heels into the dirt. He could feel the vibrations of the dog's rage humming against his chest like a high-voltage wire. "Max, no! Stop!" Daniel pleaded, but his eyes were locked on Jenkins. Why was a senior officer, a man who dealt with murderers and gang leaders, so terrified of a family dog? "Officer Jenkins, stand down!" The warden's voice boomed over the PA system, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I said stand down. That is an order." Jenkins hesitated, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. He looked at the dog with a mixture of hatred and absolute panic. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the baton, but he didn't step closer. He took a step back.
But the damage was done. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "Take the prisoner back," Jenkins spat, turning on his heel and marching toward the building without looking back. "And get that beast out of my prison!" As the handlers rushed in to drag a struggling Max away, Daniel felt a piece of his heart rip loose again. But as he was handcuffed and shoved toward the door, he caught the eye of Officer Miller. The young guard wasn't looking at Daniel. He was staring at Jenkins retreating back, a frown deepening on his face. Miller'd seen it too, the recognition, the fear. Back in his cell, the silence was louder than ever. But Daniel wasn't crying anymore. He was thinking. His mind replayed the scene in the yard over and over. Max had an instinct that was almost supernatural. He didn't growl at strangers. He growled at threats. And then the memory hit him. 5 years ago, the night of the robbery, the darkness of the alleyway behind the convenience store. Daniel had been walking Max. He had heard the gunshot, seen a figure running from the back door. It was dark, raining hard. He couldn't see a face. But Max had lunged at the shadows. Max had torn a piece of fabric from the runner's pant leg before the figure kicked him and vanished into the night. Daniel had always assumed it was the robber. But the pant leg, it was dark blue, navy blue, like a uniform. Daniel sat up straight on his bunk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rushed to the bars. "Miller! Officer Miller!" he shouted, his voice echoing down the block. Usually, shouting got you written up. But minutes later, Miller appeared. He looked different, troubled. He checked the corridor to make sure they were alone. "Keep it down, Daniel," Miller whispered, stepping close to the bars. "Jenkins is on a warpath. He's trying to get your execution moved up by 6 hours. He says you used the dog as a weapon." "He's lying," Daniel hissed, gripping the cold steel bars until his knuckles turned white. "Miller, listen to me. You saw the dog. You saw Jenkins." "I saw it," Miller admitted, his voice low. "I've never seen Jenkins look like that. Like he was seeing a ghost." "He was seeing a witness," Daniel said, the words tumbling out. "Max was there, the night it happened. He bit the guy who ran from the store. He tore his pants." Miller's eyes went wide. He took a sharp breath. "The police report said the perpetrator was wearing jeans, blue jeans." "The report was written by the first responding officer," Daniel said, staring intently into Miller's eyes. "Do you know who the first responder was? Do you know who took my statement before the detectives arrived?" Miller stayed silent for a long moment. The gears were turning. "I can check the archives," he whispered. "But if Jenkins was involved, Daniel, he's got friends in administration. If I dig into this and I'm wrong, I'm done, and you're dead anyway." "I'm dead anyway if you don't," Daniel implored. "Please, just check the shift logs from that night. Please." Miller looked at the desperate man, then back down the empty corridor. "I'll see what I can do, but we don't have much time."
But the clock was moving faster than they realized. 2 hours later, Miller sat in the dusty basement of the records room. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting long, twitching shadows. His hands were shaking as he pulled the physical file for case number 49201. He flipped past the crime scene photos, images that still turned his stomach, and found the duty roster for that night. His finger traced down the list of officers on patrol in the district. Officer T. Reynolds, Officer J. Smith, and there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. Officer Jenkins wasn't listed on patrol that night. He was marked as off-duty sick leave. Miller frowned. If Jenkins was on sick leave, why was his signature on the evidence bag for the gun found 3 blocks away? He flipped to the evidence log. Sure enough, Officer Jenkins was scribbled at the bottom. Wait. Miller pulled another sheet, the initial incident report. It was signed by a different officer, but underneath the typed text, there was a handwritten note in the margin, barely legible, half erased. Second subject cited by Perimeter Unit 4. Unit 4 was Jenkins' assigned car number.
Miller felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. Jenkins had been there. He had found the gun, but he wasn't supposed to be working. And he had omitted his presence from the official narrative completely. Why would a cop hide the fact that he was at a crime scene? Unless he wasn't there to stop the crime. Unless he was there to commit it. Miller grabbed the file and stood up, knocking his chair over. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He needed to get to the warden now. But as he turned to the door, the handle turned. The door creaked open slowly. Standing in the doorway blocking the exit was Officer Jenkins. He wasn't smiling. His hand was resting on his holster, and his eyes were dead calm. "Looking for something, Miller?" asked Jenkins, his voice smooth and terrifyingly quiet. Miller clutched the file to his chest, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Just catching up on some old paperwork, sir." Jenkins stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The lock clicked. "I don't think so," Jenkins said, stepping closer. "I think you're looking for trouble, and I think you found it." Back in the cell, Daniel paced. 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. The sun was setting, casting the cell in a blood-red hue. He had 24 hours left. He didn't know that downstairs, the only man who could save him was currently trapped in a room with a killer. But fate has a funny way of intervening, because while Jenkins thought he had covered his tracks, he had forgotten one variable. Max wasn't done yet.
"Give me the file, Miller," Jenkins said, taking another step. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "You're a smart kid. You have a fiancée, right? Don't throw your life away for a dead man walking." Miller took a step back, hitting the metal shelving behind him. The file felt heavy in his hands, like he was holding a bomb. "It's not just a file, Jenkins. It's a life. You framed him. You were there." Jenkins chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I did what had to be done. Scum like Daniel, if they didn't do this crime, they did something else. I just sped up the process." His hand tightened on the baton. "Now give me the file." "No," Miller said, his voice trembling but firm. Jenkins didn't hesitate. He lunged, closing the distance with terrifying speed for a big man. Miller tried to dodge, but Jenkins slammed him against the shelves. Files cascaded down like paper rain. Miller gasped as the wind was knocked out of his hymn, the file sliding across the floor. He kicked the file away and pressed his forearm against Miller's throat. Wrong choice. Miller clawed at the arm, crushing his windpipe, black spots dancing in his vision. He reached for his radio, his fingers brushing the talk button. He managed to click it. Static hissed through every radio in the prison. "Jenkins! Records room! He's the killer!" Miller choked out, the words garbled but audible. Jenkins' eyes went wide. He grabbed the radio from Miller's vest and smashed it against the wall. "You idiot!" he roared, raising his baton for a blow that would silence Miller permanently. But he never brought it down, because outside, something primal had been unleashed. In the parking lot, the transport van door had just slid open. The handler was preparing to lift Max's crate inside, but Max wasn't waiting. The moment the latch clicked, the dog exploded into motion. He didn't run away from the prison. He ran at it. He hit the handler in the chest, knocking him over, and bolted toward the administrative wing. Guards shouted, hands going to their weapons, but no one wanted to shoot a dog in the middle of the complex. Max was a blur of gold, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. He ignored the shouts, the sirens that were starting to wail. He was following a scent, the scent of the man he hated, the scent of the man his master feared. Back in the records room, Jenkins heard the commotion outside just a second before the glass of the ground floor window shattered inward. It was an explosion of noise and violence. Max cleared the sill, landing amidst the scattered papers, glass shards glittering in his fur. He didn't pause. He didn't bark. He launched himself at Jenkins. It was 70 pounds of muscle and fury hitting Jenkins square in the chest. Jenkins screamed as he went down, the baton flying from his hand. Max wasn't biting to kill. He was biting to hold. His jaws locked onto Jenkins' arm, the same arm that held the gun 5 years ago. "Get him off me! Shoot it! Shoot it!" Jenkins shrieked, kicking wildly at the dog. But Max was an anchor. He growled, a deep rumble that vibrated through the floor, his eyes locked on Jenkins' face. Miller, coughing and gasping for air, scrambled away from the brawl. He saw his chance. He grabbed the file from the floor and kicked the door, which Jenkins had locked. "Help! In here!" he screamed. The door burst open. The warden stood there, flanked by 3 armed guards. The scene froze. Miller, bruised and bleeding, clutching the file. Jenkins on the floor, pinned by a dog that looked like a mythical beast of vengeance. "Call them off, Miller," the warden ordered, his gun drawn but pointed to the floor. Miller whistled, a sharp 2-tone sound he had seen Daniel use in the yard. Max froze. He didn't let go immediately. He looked at Miller, then at the warden. Slowly, with a final warning growl, he released Jenkins' farm and stepped back, placing himself in front of Miller. He stood guard, chest heaving, blood on his muzzle. Not his own. Jenkins scrambled backwards, clutching his mangled arm. "That animal's crazy! Shoot it! Shoot it! Miller attacked me!" "Save it, Jenkins," Miller said raspily. He held up the file. "I have the duty logs. You weren't sick that night, and I had the incident report with your handwriting on it. You were there." The warden looked from Miller to the trembling, bleeding Jenkins. He holstered his weapon, looked at the file, then at Jenkins' fearful face. The guilt was written there more clearly than in any report. "Cuff him," the warden said softly. As the guards hauled a protesting Jenkins to his feet, reading him the rights, Miller dropped to his knees next to Max. The dog was panting, a small cut above his eye, but his tail gave a tiny, tentative thump. "Good boy," Miller whispered, resting his forehead against the dog's flank. "You just saved us both." But the battle wasn't won yet. Daniel was still in a cell, and the execution clock was still ticking. The legal system is a slow, grinding machine, and they had less than 18 hours to stop it.
The sun had set. The prison was in lockdown. The news of a guard arresting another guard spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. In his cell, Daniel heard the shouting. He heard the sirens. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt a strange sensation in his chest. The heavy weight that had been crushing him for 5 years felt lighter. Then he heard footsteps. Not the heavy, rhythmic stomp of the patrol. These were urgent, fast. Officer Miller appeared at the bars. He looked like he had been in a war. Uniform torn, a bruise blooming on his jaw, shirt stained with blood. But he was smiling. "Daniel!" Miller breathed, unlocking the cell door with shaking hands. "What happened? Is Max okay?" Daniel asked, rushing to the bars. "Max is fine! Max is a hero! And you're not going to the execution chamber tonight!" "What?" Daniel froze. "The governor just called. They granted a stay of execution. Jenkins is in custody. The state police are here. They're reopening the case." Daniel fell to his knees. The strength finally left his legs. He didn't scream. He didn't cheer. He just covered his face with his hands and wept. The sound of a man who had held his breath for 5 years, finally exhaling. But the story didn't end in that cell. 2 weeks later, the front gates of the prison, usually a place of sadness, were surrounded by cameras. News vans from every major city were parked on the grass. People held signs, "Justice for Daniel," and "Max the hero." The heavy metal gates buzzed and began to slide open slowly. The crowd went silent. First came the sound of footsteps. Then a figure emerged from the shadows of the gatehouse. Daniel wore a simple gray suit, donated by his lawyer. He looked thinner, paler, but his eyes were bright. He took his first step onto free soil, blinking against the flash of cameras. He didn't look at the reporters. He didn't look at the microphones being thrust in his face. He looked to the side, where a car was waiting. Officer Miller stood there, in civilian clothes, and next to him, sitting patiently, tail thumping a rhythm against the car door, was Max. Daniel dropped to the pavement. He didn't care about the suit. He didn't care about the dignity of the moment. "Max!" The dog broke his stay. He launched himself into Daniel's arms. This time, there were no guards to stop them, no fences, no time limits. Daniel buried his face in the fur, sobbing openly. Max licked the tears from his face, whining with pure joy. The cameras captured the image that would end up on the front page of every newspaper in the country. A man and his dog, tangled together on the concrete, surrounded by the invisible wreckage of a nightmare they had survived together. Officer Miller watched them, a lump in his throat. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the warden.
You did a good thing, son. Miller shook his head. I didn't do it alone. He pointed at the dog. He knew. He always knew.
3 months later. The sound of rain against the window used to be a torture for Daniel. In his cell, it was a reminder of the world he couldn't touch, the life washing away without him. But now, sitting on the porch of a small cabin in the mountains with a mug of hot coffee in his hands, it was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The air here didn't smell like bleach and fear. It smelled of pine needles, wet earth, and freedom. Daniel took a sip of the coffee, letting the steam warm his face. At his feet, curled up on a thick, soft rug, was Max. The dog was dreaming. His paws twitched, chasing phantom rabbits, and a soft snore escaped his nose. He was older now, his muzzle almost completely white, but he slept with a peace that Daniel envied. A car crunched up the gravel driveway. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't tense up. He knew who it was. Miller stepped out of his truck, holding a brown paper bag. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. He had quit the force a week after Daniel's release. He said he couldn't wear the badge knowing what it had hidden for so long. Now, he worked as a park ranger, a job with more trees and fewer cages. Thought you might need supplies, Miller said, walking up the steps. He placed the bag on the table, dog treats, fresh bread, and a newspaper. You spoil him, Daniel smiled, nodding at Max, who had woken up and was thumping his tail against the floorboards without lifting his head. He earned it, Miller replied, taking his seat in the rocking chair opposite Daniel. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the rain fall. It was a silence born of shared trauma and shared victory. Jenkins took a plea deal yesterday, Miller said quietly, not looking at Daniel. Life without parole. He gave up 2 other guards who helped him plant the evidence. The whole department is being clean's house. Daniel nodded slowly. He thought he would feel a surge of satisfaction, a burning vindication. But all he felt was relief. The monster was in a cage, and Daniel was out. The roles had finally reversed. I spent 5 years hating the world. I hated the judge, I hated the jury, I hated you guys. I thought humanity was rot. He reached down and rested his hand on Max's head. The dog leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. But then I realized, Daniel continued, his voice raspy, humanity didn't save me. This did. He stroked the soft fur behind Max's ears. He didn't care about the evidence. He didn't care about the uniform. He just knew the truth. Miller smiled sadly. They say dogs are good judges of character. I guess we should have listened to him a lot sooner. He never growled without a reason. Daniel repeated the phrase that had kept him sane in the darkest nights. Max sat up then, sensing the shift in emotion. He rested his heavy head on Daniel's knee, looking up with those deep, soulful brown eyes. There was no judgment in them, no questions about the lost years, just love, present, absolute love. Daniel looked at Miller. You know, people say I saved him when I adopted him from that shelter years ago. They said I gave him a second chance. Daniel leaned back, looking out at the vast, open forest that was now his backyard. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of a free man. But the truth is, Daniel said, a tear tracing the path of an old scar on his cheek. He was saving me the whole time. I just didn't know it yet. Miller nodded, standing up to leave. Sometimes saving someone is also a way of saving yourself. As Miller's truck faded into the distance, Daniel stayed on the porch. The rain stopped, and the clouds broke, letting a single ray of golden sunset illuminate the cabin. Max stood up, stretched, and nudged Daniel's hand with a wet nose. It was time for a walk, not around a prison yard, but into the woods where no fences existed. Daniel stood up and clipped the leash on, not to restrain Max, but to stay connected to him. They walked into the light, a man and his dog, leaving the long shadow of the past behind them forever.